Louisa was at home, surrounded by books and papers, the tranquil atmosphere of Friday afternoon enveloping the small apartment. As a Portuguese language teacher, she would often spend her evenings preparing lessons and grading tests. It was a ritual that calmed her, even after a long day of work. The doorbell rang, interrupting her concentration. She stretched, got up from the table, and went to the door, unaware that the sound would mark the beginning of a nightmare. When she opened the door, Louisa found a young man with short hair and a pizza delivery shirt, holding a box that emanated an irresistible aroma of cheese and tomato sauce. "Good afternoon. Stuffed crust pizza delivery for Louisa," he said, a broad smile on his face revealing white, well-kept teeth. Confused, she hesitated. "Sorry, but I didn't order any pizza." The delivery man's smile faded for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Oh, didn't you? It's the promotional pizza. You can accept it. I guarantee it's delicious." He seemed genuinely enthusiastic, but there was something in his insistence that made her uncomfortable. "No, thank you. I really didn't order anything." "You must be mistaken," Louisa replied, trying to slowly close the door. But Carlos, the delivery man, stopped her by placing his hand on the door. "Please, Louisa, just one slice. You'll love it. I'm just doing my job." The tone of his voice, although calm, had an insistence that left her uneasy. Louisa felt a chill in her stomach, and her mind began to race. What should have been a simple delivery was now turning into a strange and uncomfortable situation. "Look, I really need you to leave. I'm not interested," she said, a bit more firmly, trying to regain control of the situation. Carlos, however, did not move. His eyes fixed on hers had an intensity that seemed almost obsessive. "But I made this just for you. We're just getting to know each other, Louisa. Don't you want to be my friend?" The last word hung in the air, as if he were trying to create a connection that clearly did not exist. Louisa felt a shiver run down her spine. "I don't want to be your friend, and if you don't leave now, I'm calling the police." The threat slipped from her lips before she could assess the gravity of the situation. But the idea that he could do something to her left her terrified. Carlos finally stepped back, but not before casting a look that Louisa could not decipher. "All right, but you're going to regret not accepting the pizza." He walked away, and Louisa quickly closed the door, leaning against it as she tried to regain her composure. Her heart raced in her chest as she wondered if she was being absurd. What had just happened felt surreal. With her mind still racing, she decided she needed to talk to someone. She picked up her phone and called her best friend, Tanya. "Tanya, you won't believe what happened. I received a pizza I didn't order, and the delivery man wouldn't leave. He seemed strange," Louisa began, trying to explain the situation. "Strange how?" Tanya asked, concern already evident in her voice. "He insisted it was for me, and when I refused, he got really determined. It was uncomfortable." "Louisa, that's really weird. You need to be careful. If he comes back, call the police, okay?" "Yes, I know. I'm thinking about reinforcing the security at home. I'm going to install some cameras." The conversation continued. But Louisa couldn't shake the feeling that that day was just the prelude to something much worse. Every shadow in the apartment seemed to come to life, and the tranquility of the afternoon now felt like a distant memory. Louisa was in her living room, trying to distract herself with a book, but the tension in her chest was palpable. The silence of the house seemed to echo her restless thoughts, and the image of the persistent delivery man wouldn't leave her mind. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence, and her heart raced. With a mix of hope and fear, she approached the door. "It can't be him again," she thought as she looked through the peephole. To her relief, there was no one there. However, a moment later, the doorbell rang again, and Louisa hesitated. When she finally opened the door, there was Carlos again, with a disturbing smile on his face and a pizza box in hand. His expression was that of someone who had just won a prize, and it chilled her. "Good evening, Louisa. I brought your favorite pizza," Carlos said, with a tone that mixed joy and insistence. "I didn't order anything, Carlos. Please go away," Louisa replied, trying to stay calm. She was determined not to let fear dominate the situation. "But I'm sure you'll love it. It's the same one you ordered last time," he insisted, stepping closer to the door. He seemed oblivious to the refusal in her voice, The determination in his eyes turned into something more threatening. "Enough, Carlos, I don't want this. Get out of my way," Luisa shouted, panic starting to take over her. She tried to close the door, but he stopped her with his hand, pressing it slightly. "You don't understand, Luisa. I just want to help you. This pizza is a way to show that I care about you," he said, his voice now low and laden with an obsession that made her stomach churn. She felt the heat of anger rising within her, but also a chill down her spine that told her not to provoke him further. "Help? You're threatening me. If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police." At that moment, Carlos's expression changed. The smile faded and his eyes darkened. "You don't need to do that. I just wanted to share something special with you, Luisa. Don't make this ugly," he warned, with a tone that made her tremble. Desperate, Luisa stepped back and, without thinking twice, grabbed the phone from the table. Carlos's gaze became even more intense, as if he were evaluating her intentions. "Are you really going to call the police? That's a mistake, Luisa. I'm just trying to be your friend." "Friend? This isn't friendship, it's obsession. Now get out of my house," she screamed, pressing the emergency button on the phone. The sound of the call echoed in her ears, and the adrenaline made her feel alive, but at the same time, vulnerable. Carlos, realizing the situation was deteriorating, took a step back, but not before casting one last threatening look. "You're going to regret this," he murmured as he slowly walked away, still holding the pizza box. Luisa slammed the door shut with all her strength, leaning against it, her heart pounding uncontrollably in her chest. At any moment the police could arrive, but the uncertainty of what could happen until then left her paralyzed. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her. What did Carlos really want? What was behind that insistence? The doorbell wouldn't stop ringing, and Luisa felt a mix of anger and fear. "Why won't he just go away?" she thought as she looked out the window and saw Carlos's silhouette slowly moving away. Fear consumed her, but at the same time, a part of her couldn't help but wonder, why me? What did I do to make him choose me? Finally, the police siren sounded in the distance, and she felt a little more relieved, but the restlessness didn't leave her. If Carlos had this obsession with her, maybe this was just the beginning of a nightmare she could never imagine. The police siren cut through the silence of the night, echoing through the quiet streets of the small town. Luisa, still trembling with fear, watched the scene from the window. The officers approached Carlos, who was leaning against the wall with a look of disdain. The contrast between his indifference and the despair that plagued Luisa was palpable. She felt like a spectator in a nightmare that seemed never-ending. "You can't do this! I just brought the pizza!" Carlos protested, his voice loud and filled with rage as the officers handcuffed him. Luisa stepped back from the window, feeling her stomach churn. It was surreal to see the man who terrorized her now being treated like a criminal. But even with Carlos's arrest, a sense of insecurity overwhelmed her. "Luisa, are you okay?" One of the officers, a tall man with an attentive appearance, approached her. "You're safe now." I don't know," Luisa stammered, the words escaping her lips as if they were a whisper. "He shouldn't be here. He shouldn't find me." The officer nodded, his expression serious. "We understand that. You did the right thing by calling the police. We'll keep an eye on the situation. You need to inform us if he tries to contact you again." The officers led Carlos to the police car, and Luisa watched, her breath quickening. When the car pulled away, a heavy silence filled the air. She felt a wave of relief mixed with an increasing sense of vulnerability. The night was far from over, and the idea of being alone at home terrified her. Inside the house, Luisa threw herself onto the couch, her hands shaking. What would happen now? Carlos could be arrested, but what if he was released? What if he came back? Her mind swirled with terrifying thoughts. She grabbed her phone and called her friend Clara. "Hi, Luisa, how are you?" Clara answered, her voice filled with concern. "No, everything is not okay," Luisa said, her voice choked. "Carlos, he showed up again, and I called the police." "Oh my God! Did he do anything else? Is everything under control?" Clara asked, her worry evident in her voice. "He insisted that I accept the pizza. He seemed, I don't know, something was wrong with him. I'm scared, Clara," Luisa confessed, the pressure in her chest increasing. "Luisa, I'm coming over right now. Don't be alone," Clara said. And Luisa felt a small relief. Her friend's presence was always comforting. When Clara arrived, Luisa was sitting on the couch, still shaken. Clara enveloped her in a tight hug. "You're safe now. Let's reinforce the security of your home, okay?" Clara suggested, looking around. "Do you have any security cameras?" "No, but I think I should install some. I can't stay like this, at the mercy of what he might do," Luisa replied, her voice trembling. "Let's do that tomorrow. And you need an emergency plan. If he comes back, what will you do?" Clara asked, her voice firm. Luisa hesitated, fear paralyzing her. "I don't know. Call the police again, maybe?" "Yes, but we also need to think of something more." "Do you have any friends or family who can stay here with you? Someone who can help monitor the situation?" Clara suggested. "No, I don't want to bother anyone. I don't want to seem weak," Luisa replied, but Clara interrupted her. "Luisa, this isn't weakness. You need support. And you're not alone. I'm here for you," Clara said, the sincerity in her voice bringing a little comfort to Luisa. As the conversation continued, Luisa began to realize that the battle would not only be against Carlos, but also against the fear that was taking over her life. She needed to protect herself, not just physically but emotionally. Looking at Clara, Luisa realized that despite all the threats, there was hope amidst the despair. But the shadow of Carlos still loomed over her, a constant reminder that the fight was far from over. Luisa sat at her desk, the dim light of the lamp illuminating only a small part of the space, creating shadows that danced on the walls of her apartment. The silence was disturbing, and the feeling of being watched sent chills down her spine. Since Carlos's arrest, the routine that once seemed so simple and peaceful had become a battleground against her own mind. She had tried to return to normal, attending classes and preparing her lessons, but with every step outside, a wave of panic engulfed her. One day, while organizing her materials for class, her phone vibrated on the table. Luisa's heart raced when she saw that the message was anonymous. "Carlos will be released soon. He won't forget you." The warning hit her like a blow. She read and reread the message, trying to find some logic that would make her feel safer, but all she found was a growing despair. "No, it can't be. He can't come back," she murmured, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. The thought of Carlos being free, wandering the streets, kept her on high alert. She remembered the threatening look he had given her the last time they met, a look that seemed to penetrate her soul. With every thought, the anxiety became a snowball, growing out of control. Luisa decided she needed help. The idea of isolating herself further would consume her, and that's how she found a support group for victims of harassment. The meeting was set for that night, and she forced herself to go. Upon arriving at the venue, a simple room with chairs arranged in a circle, she felt a little relieved. The people around her shared stories that resonated with hers, making her feel like she wasn't alone. "Hi, my name is Luisa," she said with a trembling voice. "I received threats from a delivery person. He doesn't accept no as an answer." The others listened attentively, some with looks of understanding, others with expressions of pain. An older woman with gray hair and trembling hands commented, "It's a nightmare that seems never ending, but you're strong for being here." Her words brought a little comfort, but anxiety still consumed her. After the meeting, Luisa left the room with a new perspective, but the feeling of insecurity persisted. She walked through the streets trying to distract herself, but the city felt stranger and more threatening. Every face that passed, every shadow that loomed, made her feel that Carlos could be lurking at any moment. That night, she lay in bed, the thought of Carlos not letting her rest. Hours dragged on, and insomnia became her companion. The clock struck 1 in the morning when a noise jolted her awake, a crack, something that sounded like a door closing. Her heart raced again, and she quickly checked the security cameras she had installed. Her gaze swept across every corner of the screen, but the images were only blurred, and anguish filled her chest. "No, it can't be," she whispered to herself as panic took hold. She got out of bed, trembling, and went to the window. Looking outside, the street was deserted, but the darkness felt more oppressive than ever. Every movement she made seemed to echo in the silence of the night. "I can't live like this," she thought, as adrenaline coursed through her veins. "I need to do something." But what? The idea of calling the police again made her hesitate. What if nothing changed? What if Carlos was just waiting for an opportunity? With her mind clouded by fear and anxiety, Luisa decided she needed a plan. She couldn't allow fear to dominate her life. So, she sat down at her desk, grabbed a piece of paper, and began writing about her worries, her hopes, and fears. It was a way to confront reality, to put the confusion into words. "Carlos may have gotten out of prison, but I won't let him control my life," she wrote, as determination began to take shape in her heart. The fight was far from over, but Luisa knew she had to prepare for what was to come. What she didn't expect was that the real terror was still ahead, and the line between reality and nightmare was about to blur. The early morning was silent, but Luisa's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The sound of the breeze moving the leaves of the trees outside seemed amplified, as if every little noise was conspiring against her sanity. Since Carlos's release, her sense of security had evaporated, even with the security cameras installed and all the windows locked. She felt like a prisoner in her own home, a place that had once been her refuge. Sitting at the kitchen table, Luisa watched the camera images on her phone. The screen illuminated her pale, tired face, and every shadow that moved outside made her heart race. The clock on the wall read 2 a.m., and she wondered if she would ever sleep again. Her palms were sweaty, and her breath came in gasps. Her mind led her to think of the worst. "He can't be here," she murmured to herself, trying to convince herself. "He's far away, he's far away." The repetition became a mantra, but it didn't relieve the pressure in her chest. Suddenly, a sharp noise cut through the silence, a crack that seemed to come from the backyard. Luisa stopped breathing for a moment, her eyes glued to the phone screen. The echo of the sound reverberated in her head. "This can't be real," she said, almost in a whisper, as she got up from the chair. With hesitant steps, she made her way to the living room window, the curtains slightly ajar. The moonlight illuminated the area, but the darkness still held secrets. With a careful move, she pulled the curtain aside and peeked outside. Her heart pounded like a drum, and adrenaline surged through her veins. Nothing. The backyard was empty, but the restlessness persisted. She returned to the kitchen, where the phone still displayed the camera images. Carlos's face seemed to materialize in her mind, and the fear intensified. What if he's watching now? What if he knows I'm scared? The thought made her tremble. Suddenly, a new movement appeared on the screen. The silhouette of a man was approaching the house. Luisa froze. The air caught in her throat. The image was blurred, but the presence was undeniable. The man stopped in front of the front door, and Luisa felt her stomach churn. What did he want? What should she do? "Call the police! Call the police!" said the voice inside her head. But her legs wouldn't move. In a burst of impulse, she grabbed her phone and dialed the number. The operator's voice sounded in the background, but all she could hear was her own heart pounding. "What are you seeing? Where are you?" the operator asked. But Luisa couldn't form words. Only a "he" escaped her lips. As she tried to explain the situation, the camera showed the man stepping away from the door, as if his presence was merely a whim of fate. A momentary relief washed over her, but doubt soon followed. What if he comes back? What if he doesn't leave? After hanging up, Luisa decided she needed to act. Knowing the cameras might not be enough, she headed to the closet and grabbed a baseball bat her brother had left at home. She felt ridiculous, but it was better than being unarmed. With the bat in hand, she tried to convince herself that she was ready for anything. Suddenly, the noise that had frightened her earlier returned, this time louder and more forceful. It was as if someone was trying to open the back door. Luisa held her breath, her heart racing. "Carlos," she thought, and the memory of his dark eyes made her shudder. "If you're there, come out right now," she shouted, trying to sound confident, even though inside she was falling apart. The silence that followed was deafening. The only response was the echo of her own voice, and the darkness seemed to laugh at her. She approached the door, the bat held tightly. With a swift motion, she glanced through the kitchen window. What she saw made her blood run cold. Carlos's silhouette was closer than ever, and his eyes glowed with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. "Luisa, you don't need to be afraid," he said, his voice soft and seductive, but laced with a veiled threat. "I just want to deliver the pizza." At that moment, Luisa knew that the nightmare was just beginning. Luisa took a deep breath as she approached the police station, her footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. The environment was familiar, but the feeling of being there made her uneasy. The police had been her support in the past weeks, but now she wanted answers that could only come from the officers themselves. Upon entering, she was greeted by an on-duty officer who looked at her with a neutral expression. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How can I help you?" the officer asked, glancing at the computer in front of him. "I would like to know more about Carlos, the delivery guy who harassed me," Luisa replied, her voice trembling but determined. The officer consulted the screen for a few moments. "Unfortunately, there are no restraining orders against him. He has been released and is not under surveillance. What I can suggest is that you continue taking the safety measures you have already started to implement." Luisa felt a knot form in her stomach. "So he can just show up at any moment? There's nothing I can do." "I understand your concern, but the law is clear. If he hasn't violated any court order, we cannot prevent him from approaching you. I suggest you keep the police informed of any suspicious activity," the officer replied, with a tone of empathy that did not comfort her. Disheartened, Luisa left the station. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink, a beauty that seemed distant in her troubled mind. The way back home felt longer than ever. Upon arriving, she noticed something unusual. A pizza box was at the door. A chill ran down her spine. "Not again," she murmured, looking around for signs that Carlos was nearby. With her heart racing, she approached the box. Hesitant, Luisa opened it, and instead of melted cheese and pepperoni, found a photo of herself, taken from afar, accompanied by a handwritten message. "I'm always with you." Her vision blurred, and the words danced before her eyes. The shock hit her hard, causing her legs to give way. She fainted. When she woke up, she was lying on the living room floor, the lamp flickering as if trying to get her attention. Panic surged in her mind. "Carlos!" she screamed, but the house was silent. Fear enveloped her like a dark cloud. Struggling, Luisa got up and looked around. The pizza box was still there, but what terrified her was the feeling that she was not alone. She remembered what she had learned in her support group. If you feel in danger, find a safe place and call for help. With her knees shaking, Luisa slowly walked to her room, imagining every shadow as a possible threat. Upon reaching, she locked the door and called the police, her hands sweating as she held the phone. "Hello, I need help. I'm being threatened by a man who is following me," she managed to say, the words coming out rushed and fragmented. "What's your address?" asked the voice on the other end, calm but authoritative. While waiting, Luisa sat on the floor, leaning against the door. Her mind was racing, trying to piece together a puzzle that was becoming increasingly confusing. How could Carlos have taken that photo? How had he managed to enter her life so insidiously? The sound of the siren brought her back to reality. Relief and dread mixed within her. The police arrived quickly and knocked on the door. "It's the police. Open the door." The call was firm, but Luisa hesitated. What if Carlos was there, waiting for the right moment to attack? "Luisa, you're safe. Open the door," insisted a familiar voice, the same one that had spoken to her at the station. With effort, she got up and unlocked the door, allowing the officers to enter. "We're going to check the house. Are you okay?" one of the officers asked, looking into her eyes, searching for signs of panic. I don't know. He was here. He was watching me," Luisa stammered, and tears began to roll down her face. The officers began to inspect each room, and the feeling of security slowly started to seep into Luisa, although the fear never completely abandoned her. With each step they took, she felt that a new chapter of her life was about to unfold, a chapter that might not have a happy ending. The connection between her and Carlos was more complex than she could imagine, and that revelation would haunt her forever. The night slowly fell over the small two-story house, situated in a quiet neighborhood where the streetlights flickered softly under the moonlight. Inside, Lucas and Beatrice were saying goodbye to their parents, who were about to leave to visit their great-grandmother. The father, with a smile on his face, leaned against the living room door while the mother adjusted her bag. "Be careful, you two. Don't keep the television too loud and don't open the door for strangers, okay?" the mother said, looking into her children's eyes with a mix of affection and concern. "Yes, Mom, we'll behave," Lucas replied, rolling his eyes, already anxious to be free to play. Beatrice, on the other hand, nodded, a bit more serious. "And if anything happens, just call us. We're only 20 minutes away," the father added, before closing the door behind him. As soon as they heard the car pull away, the siblings ran to the living room, where the television was already showing an adventure movie. The atmosphere in the house quickly filled with laughter and playfulness, as youthful energy took over the environment. Beatrice, with her brown hair pulled into a messy bun, threw herself on the couch, and Lucas, always more hyperactive, began making jokes about the characters in the movie. "Look at what he did. That was the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen," Lucas laughed, pointing at the screen. "Ridiculous, but still better than your attempt to skateboard last Saturday," Beatrice replied with a teasing smile. Hours passed, and when the movie ended, an uncomfortable silence filled the house. The wind blew outside, accompanying the darkness that was settling in. That's when suddenly, a noise echoed at the front door, a sound that seemed like scratching, as if someone were trying to enter. The siblings exchanged nervous glances. "Did you hear that?" Beatrice asked, her voice lower. "Yeah, it came from outside," Lucas replied, his heart racing. "I'll see what it is." He got up and walked to the door, but just as he was about to look through the window, a new sound interrupted the silence. The doorbell rang repeatedly, breaking the calm of the night. Lucas's instinct made him hesitate, and he looked at Beatrice, who was approaching with a pale face. "Who could it be at this hour?" she whispered, concern evident in her eyes. "I don't know, but we need to be careful. We're not opening the door, right?" Lucas said, trying to stay calm. They moved closer to the door, peeking through the curtain crack. A scruffy-looking man was standing at the entrance, with dirty clothes and a confused expression. He seemed nervous, looking around as if he were being followed. "Please, someone help me," he shouted, his voice trembling. "I'm lost and need help." Lucas and Beatrice exchanged frightened looks. Something about the man's presence felt wrong, and the sense of discomfort grew in their chests. He looked like a character from a horror movie, and the tension in the air was palpable. "Should we call the police?" Beatrice suggested, her voice almost a whisper. "I don't know. What if he's not really dangerous?" Lucas pondered, doubts piling up in his mind. The man, realizing they weren't opening the door, began to insist. "Please, I just need a phone to call my family. I don't want to hurt you." But the way he spoke, the urgency in his voice, only heightened the siblings' unease. Lucas felt a chill down his spine, and Beatrice stepped back a little, as if she wanted to hide behind her brother. "Come on, we need to decide what to do. We can't leave him like this. But we also can't open the door," Lucas said, the tension rising between them. The man continued to call out, but with every word, distrust grew. What should have been a simple night of fun had now turned into a moment of uncertainty and fear. And so, as the darkness enveloped the house, the presence of that stranger at the door began to turn into a nightmare that the siblings never imagined they would face. Lucas held his cell phone with trembling hands, a growing knot in his throat. He pressed the dial button repeatedly, but the connection wouldn't go through. The silence that settled in the house seemed amplified, each second dragging on like an eternity. Beatrice's worried gaze met his, and the expression of uncertainty on her face only intensified the anguish that already surrounded them. "I can't call our parents," Lucas murmured, his voice almost a whisper. "What are we going to do?" Beatrice frowned, trying to stay calm amidst the panic. The man outside was becoming increasingly agitated, asking questions that didn't seem to make sense. He had mentioned something about their parents' car, as if he already knew they were out of the house. "What does he want to know about the car?" Beatrice asked, her voice trembling slightly. "This doesn't seem right, Lucas." Her brother nodded, his protective instincts kicking in. The man's presence was like a sinister shadow, and every word he spoke seemed loaded with a dark intention. The man, with his unkempt hair and dirty clothes, seemed more and more out of place, like a figure straight out of a nightmare. "We need to hide," Beatrice suggested, the idea sounding more sensible with each passing second. "Let's go to the bedroom and call the police." Lucas hesitated, a chill running down his spine at the thought of moving. But as they looked at the door, the man began to force his way in, pushing his weight against the wood with a determination that made the siblings instinctively retreat. "What are you doing?" the man shouted, his voice now louder and more threatening. "I just want help." "He doesn't want help," Lucas whispered, his voice choked with fear. "He's lying." Beatrice grabbed her brother's hand, and they both ran to the living room, where a hallway led to the bedroom. The walls seemed to close in around them, each step heavy, as if the air were being drained. When they reached the bedroom, Lucas closed the door with a tense click, and Beatrice quickly turned the lock. "What are we going to do now?" she asked, her voice almost breaking. I don't know," Lucas replied, looking around. The room was dark, the shadows cast by the streetlight creating distorted shapes. He approached the window, trying to peek outside without being seen. "We need a plan." "Let's stay here, away from the door," Beatrice suggested, her mind racing. "And if he comes in, we need something to protect ourselves." Lucas nodded, his mind spinning as he thought about how he could protect himself and his sister. He headed to the kitchen, where a knife lay on the counter. The act of grabbing the knife gave him a sense of control, a small comfort amidst the chaos. "Lucas, you can't do that," Beatrice exclaimed, realizing what he was about to do. "We can't attack someone without knowing what's going on. I'm not thinking of attacking him. I just want to be prepared," he replied, his heart racing. "If he comes in, we need to defend ourselves." Back in the room, the tension increased with every passing second. They could hear the man outside muttering to himself, his words mingling with the sound of the wood creaking under his weight. Beatrice shrank back, wishing time could rewind, that their parents were home and that everything was normal again. "Do you think he will give up?" Beatrice asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Lucas admitted, his gaze fixed on the door. "But we can't let him in here." The man then started shouting, his voice echoing through the night air. The words were confusing, a mix of pleas and threats. Lucas and Beatrice exchanged nervous glances. The situation was becoming unbearable, and with each moment that passed, the reality of being alone and without help became more oppressive. "What does he want from us?" Beatrice whispered, fear etched on her face. "I don't know, but we're in this together," Lucas replied, gripping the knife firmly. "We'll face this together." The tension in the house was palpable. Lucas, with his heart racing, held the knife in his hand, his fingers sliding slightly over the cold handle of the utensil. He never imagined that an ordinary night could turn into a nightmare. Beatrice, her eyes wide and breathless, frantically searched for something to use to lock the doors. The sound of the man outside, shouting for help, was a mix of desperation and threat. "Lucas, he's getting more aggressive," Beatrice whispered, looking out the living room window, where the street light barely illuminated the man's face. "What are we going to do?" "We need to lock ourselves in. He might be lying." "Let's go to the bedroom," Lucas replied, trying to stay calm, but his voice trembled. He felt the weight of the knife as if it were the only thing still connecting him to reality. As they moved toward the bedroom, the man's screams echoed in the darkness of the night. "I just want help. I'm lost. Please, open the door." With each phrase, his tone became more threatening, as if each word carried a burden of repressed anger. Beatrice pulled Lucas by the arm, and they both rushed into the bedroom. Once inside, they closed the door and pushed the dresser against it, as if that simple act could create a barrier against the terror outside. "What if he gets in, Lou? What will we do?" Beatrice's voice was a thread of desperation. "We have to think, Beatrice. We can't open the door. We need a plan," Lucas replied, struggling to keep his mind clear amidst the chaos around them. He looked out the window, but the darkness made it hard to distinguish what was happening outside. The silence that followed was almost deafening. "Do you think our parents are okay?" Beatrice asked, sitting on the bed with her hands clasped. They should have been back a long time ago. I don't know. I hope so, Lucas said, trying not to think about what might have happened. We need to focus. If we can stay calm, we can find a way out. Suddenly, a sound of heavy footsteps interrupted their thoughts. They looked at each other, eyes filled with fear. The man was approaching again. I know you're in there. Don't be cowards. I'm here to help. His voice resonated with a frightening sincerity, but there was an underlying tone of anger that made the siblings shrink back. He seems to be moving away, Beatrice observed, leaning in to listen better. What do you think he wants? I'm not sure, but we can't risk opening the door. He could be lying, Lucas said, the knife still firm in his hand. We need to wait a bit and see what he does. For a few moments, silence reigned in the house again. The siblings tried to calm their breathing, but adrenaline still pulsed through their veins. Lucas cast a glance toward the door, his mind racing with questions. What did that man really want? And why hadn't their parents returned yet? If he comes in, what will you do with that knife? Beatrice asked, breaking the silence. I don't know. I'll only use it if I have to. But I hope it doesn't come to that, Lucas replied, his voice firmer now. We have to stick together and not let him separate us. Do you think we can go out the back door? Beatrice suggested nervously. Maybe, but we need to wait for an opportunity. We can't be reckless, Lucas replied, looking out the window once more. The man had disappeared for a moment, but the anguish remained. Look, if he comes back, we can try to distract him somehow, right? Make noise somewhere else? Beatrice suggested, searching for a way out of the situation. Yes, that could work, but we need to be quick and careful, Lucas replied, determined. Let's stay alert and wait. The silence in the house was oppressive, and the only certainty they had was that they were together, facing this nightmare. The night was still far from over, and the real terror might have only just begun. The silence in the house was almost deafening after the echoes of the heavy footsteps faded away. Lucas and Beatrice were frozen in their places, adrenaline pulsing through their veins. What should have been a peaceful night had now turned into a palpable nightmare. Beatrice's heart pounded in her chest, and she exchanged a nervous glance with her brother. Do you think he really left? Beatrice whispered, her trembling voice almost lost in the dim light of the room. I don't know, Lucas replied, trying to stay calm. Maybe we should take a look. I'll go to the window. With cautious steps, he approached the curtain, the moonlight filtering through the fogged glass. Lucas slowly pulled back the curtain, and his eyes widened as he saw the figure of the man standing outside, his eyes fixed on the house. A chill ran down Beatrice's spine as she noticed the intensity of the stranger's gaze. He looked like a predator, studying his prey. What is he doing? Beatrice murmured, wrapping her arms around herself in a protective gesture. He's just watching, Lucas said, trying to hide the unease in his voice. We have to do something. We can't stay here. Beatrice nodded, determination beginning to replace fear. We need to go out the back door. It's the only way out. Lucas agreed, but uncertainty still hung in the air. What if he's there too? What if he catches us? We have to take the risk. We can't just sit here waiting for him to come in. She turned to her brother, her gaze steady. Let's move quickly and quietly. The siblings made their way to the back door, aware of every step they took. The atmosphere was silent except for the distant sound of their hurried breaths. As they reached the door, Lucas hesitated, feeling the wood creak under his hand. Fear paralyzed him, but the need to escape was stronger. He carefully turned the doorknob and pushed the door open slowly, the creaking hinge sounding like a scream in the dark. Just as they were about to step out, a loud noise echoed from the front door. The man was forcing his way in. Lucas's heart raced, and he exchanged a terrified glance with Beatrice. Now, he whispered, pulling his sister outside. The two ran into the yard, the cold grass under their bare feet. The air was heavy, and the darkness around them seemed to swallow every sound. The only light came from the moon, illuminating the path ahead. They knew they couldn't look back, but instinct made them feel as though they were being watched. Quick, to the shed, Beatrice shouted, pointing to the small wooden structure at the back of the yard. It was a place that usually brought memories of childhood games, but now it seemed like a refuge in a hostile world. When they reached the shed, Lucas pushed the door open forcefully, and the two entered, shutting it behind them. The interior was dark and dusty, but it was a hiding place. Beatrice leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. "Are we safe here?" she asked, her voice low and unsure. "For now, yes," Lucas replied, looking through the small, dusty window. "But I don't know for how long." The tension between them was palpable, and the silence that filled the shed was suffocating. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps approached again, and both turned, their eyes filled with fear and anticipation. "He's coming," Beatrice whispered, her eyes wide. "We need to think of something. We can't let him find us here," Lucas said, his mind racing to find a solution. "We have to prepare for what comes next." As the sound of footsteps drew nearer, the siblings' hearts beat in unison, a rhythm echoing their desperation. They knew the fight for survival was just beginning, and what was to come could change everything. Brothers Lucas and Beatrice ventured out the back door, hearts racing and breaths coming in short gasps. The yard was shrouded in almost palpable darkness, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the tree leaves. The sound of their hurried footsteps on the wet grass echoed in the silence, and the feeling of being followed haunted them like a shadow. "Do you think he's behind us?" Beatrice whispered, glancing back with a panicked expression on her face. "I don't know, but we need to hide." "Fast," Lucas replied, pulling her toward the small tool shed at the corner of the yard. The structure was old and covered in moss, an unlikely refuge, but it was all they had. As soon as they entered, Lucas slammed the door shut, while Beatrice leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. The space was cramped and dark, filled with rusty tools and dusty wooden boxes. They crouched behind an old saw, their eyes fixed on the door, hoping it wouldn't be opened. "He can't find us here," Beatrice murmured, trying to convince herself. "But what if he looks through the window?" "We can't think like that," Lucas said, running a hand through his hair. "We need to have a plan. If he comes in, we have to be ready to defend ourselves." The tension in the air was almost tangible, and the whispers of the siblings mixed with the distant sound of the man's laughter echoing in the yard. It was a low, disturbing laugh, as if he were enjoying their fear. "Where are you, kids?" he called, his voice laden with a malice that seemed to penetrate the walls of the shed. "I just want to help. I just want to play. Play? He's crazy!" Beatrice exclaimed, looking at Lucas with wide eyes. "This isn't a game." "Shut up, he can hear you," Lucas cut in, his voice low but firm. They struggled to stay calm, but every word the man said seemed to increase the pressure in their chests. His laughter continued, now closer, making their hearts race. "I know you're in there, don't hide, I just want to help," the man insisted, his voice now softer, almost seductive. "You have no idea how dangerous the world can be. I'm the only one who can protect you." "Protect? From what?" Beatrice asked, still whispering. But curiosity was beginning to seep into her fear. "What does he mean by that?" "I don't know, but we can't trust him. He's a stranger," Lucas replied, but his voice was tinged with doubt. The man had become an enigmatic figure, and something in the tone of his voice made Lucas hesitate. Suddenly, the sound of something banging against the shed door made both of them flinch. The man was outside, and his presence was becoming increasingly oppressive. "I'm just trying to help you. You don't have to be afraid of me," he shouted. But his voice was tinged with a desperation that didn't match his words. "We have to do something. We need to get out of here," Beatrice said, looking around for an escape. Lucas's eyes landed on a small window at the back of the shed. "Maybe we can get out through there," he suggested, but the idea seemed risky. "What if he catches us?" she questioned, her voice trembling. "If we stay here, he'll find us anyway. We have to take the risk," Lucas decided, already standing up and heading for the window. As he pushed the window open carefully, the sound of the man's laughter grew more frantic, as if he were reveling in the tension in the air. "I'm coming, kids. Don't be scared. I just want to have a chat," the man insisted, but his words sounded more like a threat than an invitation. "Now," Lucas whispered, opening the window and pulling Beatrice toward it, as their hearts pulsed in unison with the fear that surrounded them. They needed to escape before it was too late. Beatrice trembled, not only from the fear that enveloped her but also from the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The old radio in her hands felt like an object from another time, with its chipped paint and buttons that creaked when pressed. She turned the tuning knob, trying to pick up a station that could help them, but all she heard was static, an oppressive buzzing that made her heart race even faster. "Lucas, help me turn this on, we need help," Beatrice pleaded, desperate, her eyes glued to the slightly open door of the cabin. She turned the knob again, but only got more static. The radio seemed to mock their situation, as if it were aware of the terror they faced. "Calm down, Beatrice. We can't make noise. If he hears us—" Lucas didn't finish the sentence, but the look of panic in his eyes was clear. They were cornered, and the possibility of being discovered was terrifying. Suddenly, a loud creak echoed through the cabin. The door slowly opened, revealing the disheveled-looking man, who was now closer than ever. He entered with a crooked smile on his face, his eyes gleaming in a way that made the siblings even more frightened. "Oh, what a surprise. I didn't know you were here," he said, his voice smooth but laced with an implicit threat. "Who are you? What do you want?" Lucas shouted, gripping the knife tightly, trying to appear braver than he actually felt. Beatrice beside him shrank against the wall, the radio almost falling from her trembling hands. "I'm an old family friend," the man replied, taking a step forward. "Don't you remember me? I've been present at many happy moments in your lives." He moved closer slowly, as if he were there to reminisce. But the way his eyes sparkled made everything more sinister. "You're not a friend to anyone, you're trying to hurt us," Beatrice exclaimed, her voice loud and full of desperation. "Get out of here." The man let out a low laugh that reverberated in the small cabin. "Hurt? No, I'm here to protect you. Believe me, what your parents are doing is much more dangerous than I am. They are hiding secrets that could destroy the whole family." Lucas and Beatrice exchanged confused glances, the tension rising. "Secrets? What secrets?" Lucas asked, positioning himself between Beatrice and the man, the knife raised as a barrier. "Oh, you have no idea what's coming. That visit to your great-grandmother? It's not just a simple visit. It's an attempt to escape something much bigger, something that is approaching." The man leaned forward, as if he wanted to share a secret. "I'm here to help you stay safe." "Shut up!" Beatrice screamed, her eyes filled with tears. "You can't fool us." He ignored her, continuing his speech. "I was expelled from the family because of a truth that no one wanted to face. But I am the only one who can protect you from this approaching evil. I know what's going on, and you need to trust me." "Trust you? After all this?" Lucas said, his voice trembling but determined. "You're invading our home." The man smiled, but there was a glint of madness in his eyes. "What if I told you the real threat is inside your own home, that your parents are involved in something that could destroy everything?" The atmosphere grew heavy, and the siblings felt suffocated by the man's words. What he was saying seemed absurd, but there was an unsettling truth in his voice. The radio, although only emitting static, seemed to echo the rising tension, as if it were aware of the gravity of the situation. "You're going to have to choose, kids," the man said, his voice now soft and persuasive. "Run or stay and face what's coming. But I assure you, if you stay with your parents, you won't be safe. The choice is yours." The moral dilemma hung in the air, and the siblings were paralyzed by uncertainty. What to do? Trust or distrust? The night, which had started out calm, was now turning into a labyrinth of secrets and fears, where every choice could lead to irreversible consequences. In the small and quiet village Hope, where the nights used to be calm and full of stars, an air of anxiety lingered. It was a typical autumn night, with the smell of wet earth and the whispering of the wind among the trees. In an isolated spot, away from the curious gazes of the residents, 3 teenagers gathered, ready to carry out a risky plan. Lucas, with his bold demeanor and shrewd look, led the conversation. Beside him, Tiago, more reserved and cautious, shook his head, visibly unsure. Carla, the only girl in the trio, alternated between nervous laughter and worried expressions. "Come on, Tiago. It's just an old house. What could go wrong?" Lucas exclaimed, excitement evident in his voice. He was always seeking adrenaline, and that mission, although illegal, represented a way to escape the monotony of life in the city. But what if they're awake? What if they have a dog? Tiago protested, anxiety showing in his tone. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to cross a dangerous line. However, the pressure from his friends and the need to feel part of something bigger kept him there, standing, albeit hesitantly. "Oh, please. Are you worried about a couple of old folks? They probably don't even have the strength to scream," Carla interjected, trying to ease the tension. But inside, a knot of fear troubled her. Although she wanted to feel brave and fearless, the idea of breaking in made her nervous. The three approached the Almeida's house, an old building surrounded by a small garden, where wilted flowers seemed to tell stories of times gone by. The dim light emanating from the living room was a clear sign that the couple was still awake. "Look, they're there. It's now or never," Lucas whispered, pulling Tiago by the arm. With a nervous glance, Tiago hesitated once more, but was dragged along by Lucas's determination. "Come on, Tiago. If we're quick, they won't even notice," Carla insisted, trying to mask her own uncertainty. As they reached the front door, Lucas signaled for them to stop. He looked at his friends, took a deep breath and said, "Remember, just grab a few things and get out, quick and quiet." With racing hearts, Lucas forced the doorknob and, to his surprise, the door creaked open. The trio entered the house, surrounded by a darkness that seemed to swallow the sounds of the night. The interior was cozy, but at the same time, it carried an aura of abandonment. The smell of aged wood and extinguished candles filled the air. "Watch out for the noises," Tiago whispered as they moved like shadows through the entry hall. Tension hung between them, and each step seemed to echo like thunder. The trio dispersed, each heading into a different room, searching for items that could be easily taken. "Hey, look at this," Carla exclaimed, holding an old music box that was still working. The soft, nostalgic sound almost made her forget what they were about to do. "This is beautiful." "Leave that, Carla. The focus is on what we can sell. Let's go," Lucas reminded her impatiently. The adrenaline coursing through his veins made him ignore any thoughts of regret. Tiago, on the other hand, remained at the door, watching the scene with a worried look. "Lucas, this isn't right. We should leave," he said, his voice trembling. But Lucas, with a gleam in his eyes, didn't seem willing to give up. What began as a simple prank was turning into something much darker, but they were so caught up in the excitement that they didn't realize the precipice they were approaching. Inside the Almeida's house, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The teenagers, hearts racing and eyes wide, moved stealthily through the dimly lit rooms. Lucas led the expedition, his mind buzzing with plans for easy wealth. "Check this out," he whispered, holding up an old jewelry box he found on one of the living room shelves. The soft light from the lamp revealed pearl earrings and a gold ring that shimmered as if it had a life of its own. Tiago and Carla approached, amazed. "This is worth a lot," Tiago commented, trying to contain his excitement. But Carla, with a worried expression, shook her head. "Guys, we have to go. What we're doing here isn't right." Her voice, though low, carried a weight that seemed to echo through the walls of the house. "We're just taking what they don't use anymore," Lucas replied, trying to justify the situation. "Besides, who cares about these old folks? They won't even notice something is missing." He continued rummaging through the room, ignoring Carla's words. Meanwhile, Carla stepped away a little, her eyes fixated on framed photos that adorned the shelf. She observed images of the couple in moments of joy, dancing at parties and traveling, genuine smiles on their faces. There was something sad and beautiful in those memories, and it made her hesitate. "Lucas, let's go. I don't like it here," she insisted, her voice trembling. But Lucas was obsessed. "Calm down, Carla. Look, we still have the upstairs. There could be more valuable things. Let's take advantage while we can." He was determined, and Tiago, though hesitant, nodded in agreement. "I think Lucas is right. We can't leave now, especially without getting what we came for." The tension between them grew, and the festive spirit of the adventure dissipated, giving way to a rising discomfort. Carla, with her heart racing, heard a noise coming from upstairs, a creaking of wood that made her freeze. "What was that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. Tiago looked at Lucas, who gestured for silence. It must be just the wind. Let's keep going. But Carla wasn't convinced. I don't want to stay here. Something is wrong. Let's go. Her voice rose a little more, but Lucas, caught up in the adrenaline, merely replied, Don't be a coward, Carla. We're almost there. At that moment, a shadow loomed on the staircase, and Mr. Almeida appeared, his eyes wide at the sight of the intruders. Shock enveloped the atmosphere, and silence became deafening. What are you doing here? He shouted, his voice echoing through the house. Tiago, overcome with panic, gripped the gun he was carrying, his hand trembling. I don't know, he stammered, unsure of what to do. In a desperate impulse, he pulled the trigger, and the sound of the shot shattered the air, echoing like thunder in the silent night. Mr. Almeida's body fell heavily to the ground, and the world around seemed to stop. Panic set in among the teenagers. Lucas, in shock, looked at Tiago, who was visibly trembling, the gun still in his hands. What did you do? Lucas shouted, his voice filled with disbelief. Carla, paralyzed by the horror of the scene, covered her mouth with her hand, tears beginning to stream down her face. No, this can't be happening, she murmured, the reality of the situation hitting her mind like a hammer. We need to get out. Fast, Tiago exclaimed, finally moving. But Lucas's words stopped him. What if he's not? The fear in Lucas's eyes reflected the brutality of what had just happened. The trio was now trapped in a web of consequences they could barely comprehend. Their lives, which until then had been marked by mischief, had transformed into a nightmare they could no longer control. The echo of the gunshot resonated through the Almeida household like a deafening roar, shattering the tranquility of the night and plunging the teenagers into a sea of panic. Lucas, Tiago, and Carla froze, their hearts racing uncontrollably, as Mr. Almeida's figure collapsed to the floor, a look of disbelief frozen on his face. The silence that followed was deafening, a terrifying pause before reality seeped into the confused minds of the young people. My God, what have we done? Tiago murmured, his eyes wide and his voice trembling. He looked to Lucas for an explanation, but his friend appeared just as stunned as he was. I didn't mean to shoot. It was an accident, Lucas replied, his voice quaking as he crouched near the elderly man's lifeless body. The scene was surreal. The room, once full of life and memories, was now steeped in unbearable horror. Carla, in turn, stepped back, her hand covering her mouth in a gesture of revulsion and shock. We need to get out of here, Carla exclaimed, her eyes shining with desperation. Come on now. The urgency in her voice brought Tiago and Lucas back to their senses. But before they could move, a sound of quick footsteps began echoing down the hallway. The sound of panic spread, and adrenaline took over. They exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. What followed was a frenzied dash toward the front door. The feeling that the world was collapsing around them intensified. Quick, Lucas! Tiago shouted, already at the door, twisting the doorknob that seemed to refuse to open. Lucas's heart raced in a frantic rhythm, his mind spinning around the gravity of what had just happened. Finally, the door swung open, and they burst outside, gasping for breath. But what awaited them outside was an equally terrifying scene. Neighbors were emerging from their homes, drawn by the noise. Lights were turning on, and a distant siren began to approach, like a harbinger of what was to come. We have to hide, Carla pleaded, pulling her friends toward a nearby alley. The darkness felt welcoming compared to the bright lights of the houses and the inevitable fate that awaited them. But safety was an illusion. They knew they could not escape what they had done. Let's go to the garage, Tiago suggested, pointing to a small space next to the Almeida house. The three crouched down, hoping the siren wouldn't reach them. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of their heavy breathing and the frantic pounding of their hearts. This is all your fault, Tiago, Carla shot, frustration evident in her voice. If you hadn't brought that gun— Shut up, Carla. This isn't the time for that. Lucas cut in, his voice laden with despair. He was just as confused as the others, trying to understand the repercussions of what had happened. The siren drew closer, and soon a police car pulled up in front of the Almeida residence. The red and blue lights spun, casting shadows that danced around them. Panic took hold of the group, and the feeling that there was no way to escape reality enveloped them like a heavy blanket. "We're screwed," Tiago murmured, his head down. "What are we going to say?" "We can't tell the truth," Carla replied, her voice so low it was almost lost. We need to find a way to get out of this." But before they could formulate any plan, the voices of the police began to echo in the distance, calling for the Almeida family and checking the house. The tension in the air was palpable, and each of the teenagers felt the weight of what they had caused. Despair took over, and tears began to slide down Carla's face as reality became increasingly unbearable. "We're going to have to face this," Lucas said, feeling a wave of determination mixed with fear. "We can't run forever." The three exchanged glances, aware that their lives would never be the same. What had started as an innocent prank had turned into an irreversible tragedy, and the small Villa Esperanza would never see them the same way again. In the small police station room, the air was heavy and charged with tension. Lucas, Tiago, and Carla were placed in separate rooms for questioning, each facing a detective who seemed determined to extract the truth from their young, tormented souls. Lucas, with disheveled hair and wide eyes, sat in a hard chair, staring at the floor. The detective, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, began to question him. "What were you doing at the Almeida house?" he asked, his voice deep and relentless. Lucas hesitated, his mind spinning with memories of that fateful night. We just wanted to grab some things. It wasn't supposed to be like this," he murmured, his voice faltering. The detective leaned forward, the intensity in his gaze making Lucas feel a chill down his spine. "And what do you think happened to Mr. Almeida? Do you think that was an accident?" "I don't know. It was an accident. I didn't want this to happen," Lucas exclaimed, the words spilling from his mouth like a silent scream. The detective crossed his arms, watching him with a critical gaze, as if trying to decipher the truth hidden behind the facade of a lost teenager. Meanwhile, in the room next door, Carla was trying to find the strength to express herself. Tears streamed down her pale face as she looked at the detective, who seemed more interested in his own thoughts than in her pain. "I didn't want to be a part of this. I just wanted to be accepted," she said, her voice choked. Lucas and Tiago were so sure it was a good idea. "I just went along." The detective watched her for a moment before asking, "And do you think being accepted was worth it? What happened to Mr. Almeida?" Carla closed her eyes, recalling the terrified look on the man's face when Tiago fired the gun. "No, it didn't count. I feel so guilty. I can't stop thinking about Mrs. Almeida. She's all alone now," she confessed, the pain in her heart almost unbearable. In the hallway, Tiago awaited his turn in the interrogation, his mind filled with dark thoughts. He felt like a prisoner not only of the police station, but of his own choices. When he entered the room, the detective immediately confronted him. "You fired the gun, Tiago. What do you have to say about that?" "It was an accident. I never meant to hurt anyone," Tiago replied, his voice raised, almost pleading for understanding. I was scared. He appeared out of nowhere, and I didn't think." The detective kept his gaze fixed on Tiago, trying to catch any hint of sincerity. "And do you think Mrs. Almeida, who is now alone in mourning, will understand this as an accident? What will you tell her when she finds out you were one of the ones responsible?" Tiago swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the question. "I don't know. I just wanted to turn back time. I just wanted none of this to have happened." As the interrogations continued, the city of Villa Esperanza buzzed with heated discussions. People were divided between those calling for justice and those who saw the teenagers as products of a failed system. On the streets, murmurs grew louder, and voices echoed like a chorus of condemnation. "These kids don't deserve forgiveness. Look at what they did," shouted a man in the town square, surrounded by a group nodding in agreement. "We need to show that actions have consequences." "But they're just kids. We can't forget that," retorted a woman, her expression concerned. "We need to understand what led them to this. What were they living through before?" Meanwhile, Mrs. Almeida's pain became a symbol of life's fragility. Her eyes, once filled with love and life, now reflected a deep emptiness. She sat alone on her couch, surrounded by photos and memories of a past that now seemed distant and unreal. The loss of her husband was a wound that would never heal, and the thought that those young people could have been different if they had received the help they needed tormented her. As the upcoming trial approached, the defense prepared its arguments. The shot was accidental, argued the lawyer, attempting to show that the teenagers were not monsters but rather victims of circumstances. However, Mrs. Almeida's pain echoed in every corner of the courtroom, transforming the atmosphere into a heavy and dark place where everyone sought answers that no one had. The fate of the young people was about to be decided, but the truth about what really happened that fateful night continued to hang in the air, shrouded in mystery and pain. The cold walls of the cell echoed Tiago's confused thoughts. He sat in a corner, his eyes fixed on the concrete floor, as frustration and regret intertwined in his mind. The weight of guilt over Mr. Almeida's death was an unbearable burden. He remembered the elderly man's terrified look, how his eyes widened, and the frozen moment when the shot echoed through the house. It was a noise that would never leave his head. "Why did I do that?" he murmured to himself, his voice barely audible. The memories of what should have been just a prank transformed into a nightmare that consumed him day after day. In a small cell next door, Carla tried to find solace in the words she wrote in a letter to her mother. "I didn't want to be here, Mom. I just wanted to feel like I belonged somewhere," she wrote, tears streaming down the paper. Each word was a silent scream of despair. "We're trapped in a cycle we can't break. I'm so scared." The pen trembled in her hand as she fought against the pain and guilt. Life in prison was monotonous and heavy. Days dragged on, and the young people found themselves surrounded by a reality they never imagined. The looks of disdain and condemnation from the guards were constant, and each seemed loaded with judgment. Even among the other inmates, the atmosphere was thick, as if the walls were absorbing the laments and cries of pain from each one. It was on one of those days, while Carla was sitting at the small table in the cafeteria, that Mrs. Almeida made her first visit. The environment immediately fell silent. The other prisoners watched with curiosity and apprehension, while Carla felt her heart race. Why did she come here, she thought. The woman, although visibly aged and marked by pain, had a dignity that lit up the room. "Hi, Carla," Mrs. Almeida said, her voice soft yet firm. The young girl looked down at the floor, feeling the weight of guilt increase. "I'm not here to blame you. I'm here to talk about forgiveness." Carla looked up, surprised. "Forgiveness? How can you forgive me? I killed your husband." Anger and pain erupted in her voice, and she couldn't hold back the tears. Mrs. Almeida took a deep breath. "I lost my husband, yes, but what happened that night was an accident, and I don't want to live my life full of hatred. I came here because I believe that we all have the capacity to learn from our mistakes." Tiago, who was watching the conversation from afar, felt a mix of admiration and disbelief. "How can you be so strong?" he whispered to Carla, who was still in shock. "I don't know if I could forgive someone who did that to me." "Sometimes, strength comes from a place we don't even know exists," Carla replied, wiping her tears away. "She lost everything, and yet here she is, trying to do her best." The conversation unfolded slowly, with Mrs. Almeida sharing stories about her husband and their happy memories. She spoke about how he loved life and enjoyed helping others, emphasizing that love and compassion were powerful forces. "I want you to understand that each of us has a choice. We can be prisoners of our past, or we can choose to move forward, even if it's hard," she said with an intense gaze. Tiago and Carla exchanged glances, realizing that there was a lesson there, something that could change their lives, even within that cell. Life had become a dark maze, but perhaps there was a way out, a path to redemption. With time, Mrs. Almeida continued to visit the young people in their cells, not as a avenger, but as a guide. The conversations became a safe space where pain could be shared and hope cultivated. And as the months went by, Tiago and Carla began to understand that despite the mistakes of the past, there was a possibility of a different future. A future where they could redeem themselves and learn to live again. The sunlight timidly filtered through the gray clouds hovering over Villa Esperanza, as if the city itself were in mourning for the tragedy that had shaken its peace years ago. Lucas, now a 20-year-old young man, walked down the main street, feeling the weight of the hostile stares that followed him. Every step he took seemed to echo the whispers of disapproval among the residents, whose lives had been marked by the death of Mr. Almeida and by his thoughtless actions. He stopped in front of the old Almeida house, now closed and shrouded in silence. The flowers in the garden, once lovingly tended by Mrs. Almeida, looked wilted and forgotten, reflecting the pain that still lingered in the air. Lucas remembered how, in his teenage years, the house had been a symbol of safety and joy in the neighborhood. Now it was just a reminder of what he had destroyed. "Lucas," a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Carla, who had also served her sentence and was trying to reintegrate into society. "You shouldn't be here. People still haven't forgiven you." "I know," Lucas replied, his voice choked with emotion. "But I needed to come. I needed to see where it all began, where everything went wrong." Carla looked at the house with sadness. "Sometimes I wonder if we could have done things differently, if we had thought before acting." "I can't forget," Lucas interrupted, frustration evident in his tone. "What we did could have been different. And now, I don't know how to deal with it." The two young people stepped away from the house, seeking a quieter place to talk. They walked to the city park, where they used to spend their late afternoons playing ball and laughing carefreely. The place now felt gloomy, as if the weight of the past still lingered in the trees and the weathered benches. "I still can't talk to Thiago," Lucas confessed. "He's in there and I don't know what to say. What can I say to him?" Carla sighed, thinking of the right words. "Maybe you should be honest. Tell him you regret it, that you wish things had been different. Sometimes the truth is all we need to hear." Lucas looked down, contemplating Carla's suggestion. "But what if he doesn't want to listen to me? What if he's still so full of anger and pain that he can't look at me?" "You'll never know until you try," she replied firmly. "The life we lead now is a chance we have, a chance to change the narrative, to not just be the villains of this story." He nodded, feeling a little more strengthened by the conversation. However, a shadow of doubt still lingered in his mind. What did he have to offer Thiago? What could he do to mend what was broken? Lucas decided to visit Thiago in prison, even though nervousness consumed him. Upon arrival, the heavy atmosphere of the place enveloped him. The cold walls and the disillusioned looks of the other inmates made his heart race. He sat in the plastic chair in front of Thiago, who looked thinner and more worn than he remembered. "Hey, little brother," Lucas began, his voice hesitant. "How are you?" "How do you think I am?" Thiago retorted, frustration evident in his tone. "Locked up for something I never thought would happen. Locked up because I was an idiot." Lucas took a deep breath, trying to find courage. "Thiago, I wanted to tell you something. The break-in wasn't just a robbery. Mr. Almeida was sick, very sick. He wanted a dignified death. We didn't know that. We only thought of ourselves." Thiago's eyes narrowed. "Are you trying to tell me that we were complicit in something even more cruel? That our action, our choice, was the last thing he wished for?" "I don't know," Lucas replied, anguish taking hold of him. "But I feel like everything turned into a tragedy we never wanted. Not just because of his death, but because of what we became." Silence. The weight of the revelation hung between them, and Thiago seemed to reflect deeply. "Lucas, this changes everything. What do we do with this? What do we do with this pain?" Thiago asked, his voice now softer. "Maybe the only thing we can do is try to live, try to be better. And who knows, maybe one day find a way to make things right." Thiago looked down, thoughtful. "It's a start, I guess, but it won't be easy." "I know," Lucas said, a faint smile appearing on his lips. "But we're not alone. We're in this together." And so, with the hope of an uncertain future, but filled with possibilities, the two friends began to sketch a new chapter in their lives, aware of the consequences of their actions, but determined to seek redemption.